I am Lauren, 33 years old, and my parents left a wrapped box on my doorstep with a single terrifying warning attached to the ribbon. The note read simply, "Do not make a scene." When I lifted the lid, I did not cry or collapse. Instead, I stared at the contents meant to destroy my life, picked up my phone, and calmly dialed 911. Minutes later, my husband stepped inside, saw two armed police officers standing in our foyer, and turned completely pale. "Please do not tell me they actually did it," he whispered. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been stabbed in the back by the very people who share your blood and the person who shares your bed. Because what I did next ensured they would pay for their betrayal down to the last miserable cent. The crisp Chicago wind was biting that Tuesday morning when I opened my front door. Instead of my coffee delivery, I found a sleek black box perfectly centered on my welcome mat. It looked like a high-end corporate gift wrapped elegantly in thick silver ribbon. Tucked securely beneath the bow was a handwritten card on my Mother Patricia expensive stationery. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, perfectly looped and utterly cold. The message was brief. "Do not make a scene. Gavin has agreed this is the best way to save your sister charity fund. Please vacate the premises before Friday." My heart pounded violently against my ribs as I carried the heavy box into my kitchen. I set it down on the massive marble island I had paid for in cash 2 years ago, after working grueling 80-hour weeks building my crisis public relations firm from the ground up. I untied the silver ribbon and pulled off the tight lid. Inside lay a stack of thick legal documents neatly tabbed with sticky notes and highlighted in yellow. I picked up the first stack. It was a corporate transfer agreement for Aegis Communications, my public relations firm. My life work, my sweat and tears, all neatly transferred entirely into the name of my younger sister Brittany. I flipped frantically to the signature page. There was my name signed in blue ink. But I had never signed this document. The signature was a flawless, malicious forgery. I moved to the second document with trembling hands. It was a formal eviction notice. The legal jargon stated that the deed to my home, the house I had purchased solely with my own money before our marriage, had somehow been transferred to a trust controlled by my parents Richard and Patricia. The notice formally demanded I vacate my own property by the end of the week. The third and final stack of papers felt like a physical strike to my chest. They were divorce proceedings. They were already filed, bypassing mandatory waiting periods through some obscure loophole and bearing another forged signature. This document relinquished all my marital assets, personal savings, and investment accounts directly to my husband Gavin. Most people would sink to the kitchen floor and sob at the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My own parents and my husband of 5 years had conspired to completely strip me of my business, my home, and my financial security, all to bail out my sister, the eternal golden child, who could never hold down a job or face a single consequence. But I am a crisis public relations manager. I handle catastrophic corporate meltdowns for a living. I am trained to compartmentalize panic, suppress emotional reactions, and execute surgical counterattacks. I did not shed a single tear. The betrayal was so absolute, so maliciously calculated, that it burned away any lingering affection I had for them. A cold, absolute clarity washed over my mind. I grabbed my phone from the counter. I did not call my mother to ask why she would do this to her own flesh and blood. I did not call Gavin to scream and demand an explanation. I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered immediately. "I need police officers at my residence right now." I stated, my voice steady, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I am reporting a massive case of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery involving millions of dollars in corporate and personal assets." While waiting for the authorities to arrive, my mind raced rapidly through the implications of my mother note. She mentioned saving Brittany Charity Fund. Brittany had recently started some lifestyle wellness charity that was essentially a vanity project to boost her social media following. If they needed to steal my entire company and my house to save it, Brittany must have committed some colossal financial disaster. And Gavin, my supposedly loving husband who kissed my forehead before leaving for the gym just 2 hours ago, was in on the entire plot. He had sold me out for a payout. Two Chicago police officers arrived at my door 12 minutes later. I welcomed them inside, offering them coffee, as if we were sitting down for a standard morning corporate meeting. I laid the forged documents out clearly on the kitchen island. I showed them my real signature on my driver license and my passport, pointing out the microscopic discrepancies in the forged ink on the transfer agreements. I explained the timeline, the true value of Aegis Communications, and the horrifying fact that my own family had orchestrated this hostile takeover. As Officer Miller was taking down the details of the corporate transfer fraud, the heavy oak front door clicked open. Heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer. Gavin was home from his morning workout humming a cheerful tune, completely oblivious to the fact that his carefully constructed house of cards was about to detonate. The tension in the room spiked instantly. I stood perfectly still, watching the hallway with eyes like ice. The officers turned, hands resting near their duty belts. Gavin strolled into the kitchen, a gym bag slung casually over his shoulder, a protein shake in his hand. He stopped dead in his tracks. The plastic shaker bottle slipped from his grip, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud thud, splattering protein liquid across the baseboards. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He stared at the two armed officers, then looked at the black box and the scattered documents on the island. He looked at me, his eyes wide with pure, unfiltered panic. "Please do not tell me they actually did it," he whispered, his voice shaking. Gavin stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds before his survival instincts kicked in. I watched the panic drain from his face, replaced instantly by a mask of deep, agonizing concern. It was a masterful performance I had seen him use on investors when his hedge fund underperformed, but watching him deploy it against me was entirely different. He stepped carefully over the spilled protein shake, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening as he approached Officer Miller and his partner. "Officers, I am so sorry you had to be dragged into this," Gavin said, his voice dripping with practiced empathy. He turned to me, his eyes full of fake sorrow. "Sweetheart, we talked about this. You promised me you would call Dr. Evans if the paranoia came back." Officer Miller frowned, his hand dropping slightly from his belt. "Sir, your wife is reporting a major financial theft and forged legal documents." Gavin let out a heavy, rehearsed sigh. He ran a hand through his damp hair, looking every bit the exhausted but devoted husband. "I know what she is reporting, officer. My wife owns a crisis management firm. She works 90-hour weeks handling catastrophic corporate scandals. The stress has completely broken her. She has been having these severe manic episodes, hallucinating that her own family is plotting against her. Those papers," he gestured vaguely toward the kitchen island, "she must have printed them herself in a delusional state. She has been talking about these wild conspiracies for weeks. We are trying to get her psychiatric help." I stood silently, my arms tightly crossed across my chest, watching the man I had slept next to for 5 years attempt to strip away my sanity just as easily as he had tried to strip away my assets. It was a textbook gaslighting maneuver. He was deliberately using my intense career and my financial success as a weapon to make me look like a hysterical, overworked woman cracking under pressure. The officers glanced at each other, a flicker of doubt crossing their faces. In situations like this, police are trained to look for erratic behavior. Gavin was banking on me screaming, crying, and defending myself wildly to prove his point. He wanted me to act crazy so they would dismiss the forgery as a mental health crisis. I did not scream. I did not cry. I picked up the heavy crystal vase resting on the edge of the dining table. It was a wedding gift from my parents, a wildly expensive, completely useless object I had always deeply hated. Without breaking eye contact with Gavin, I dropped it straight onto the hardwood floor. The crystal shattered with a deafening crack, sending sharp shards flying across the room. The sudden, violent noise sliced through Gavin's carefully constructed narrative. The officers jumped their hands, instantly returning to their radios. Gavin flinched violently, his fake empathy evaporating into genuine fear. "Now that I have your undivided attention," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of the hysteria he was so desperately trying to provoke. "Let us talk about facts. Paranoia is a mental condition. High-definition video and audio recording, however, is admissible evidence in a court of law." I picked up my iPad from the counter. 2 weeks ago, I had noticed items on my desk slightly out of place. Being in the business of crisis management, I do not believe in coincidences. I had hired a private security contractor to install a hidden micro camera directly above my home office door, completely separate from our main home security system that Gavin had access to. I tapped the screen, loading the cloud storage application, and turned the volume all the way up. I swiped to the footage from exactly 6:15 this morning. The screen illuminated the faces of all 3 officers and my suddenly sweating husband. The video showed the front hallway. The audio was crystal clear. It showed Gavin fully dressed in his gym clothes, quietly unlocking the front door. My parents, Richard and Patricia, stepped into the foyer. My mother was holding the very same black box that now sat on my kitchen island. "Is she awake?" my mother whispered on the recording. "No, she took her sleep medication," Gavin's voice replied through the iPad speaker. "The safe is in the office. You have exactly 5 minutes to get the corporate seal and the notary stamps before I have to leave for the gym. Just leave the box on the mat on your way out. Make sure you get the transfer documents stamped perfectly. If Aegis Communications is not in Brittany's name by noon, we are all going to federal prison." The video continued, showing my parents sneaking into my office and emerging minutes later with my proprietary corporate seal. I paused the video right on Gavin's face as he hugged my mother, sealing the conspiracy that was meant to leave me destitute. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The doubt vanished entirely from the officers' faces, replaced by stern professional anger. Officer Miller turned to Gavin, stepping squarely into his personal space. "Does that look like a hallucination to you, sir?" Officer Miller demanded. Gavin's mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. He took a step back, raising his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. "Wait, you do not understand. Lauren, honey, let me explain. It is not what it looks like. Brittany is in trouble. We just needed to borrow the company to secure a loan. We were going to give it back, I swear. You forged my signature to transfer my life work, tried to evict me from the house I bought, and filed fraudulent divorce papers to steal my savings," I stated, stepping around the shattered crystal to look him dead in the eye. "You are not a concerned husband, Gavin. You are a common thief. And as of this exact second, you are trespassing on my property." Officer Miller did not hesitate. He unclipped his radio. "Sir, based on the video evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud and theft, you are ordered to vacate these premises immediately. Detectives will be following up regarding the forgery charges. If you refuse to leave, you will be arrested for trespassing right now." Gavin looked wildly around the kitchen, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked at the locked front door, then at the officers, and finally at me. "Lauren, please. My wallet and my keys are upstairs. I need my clothes. I have nowhere to go." I picked up the fake eviction notice he had helped print. "This document says I need to vacate by Friday. I think you need to vacate right now. I will mail your belongings to your lawyer once you find one willing to take a federal wire fraud case." Gavin tried to protest again, but Officer Miller's partner placed a firm, uncompromising hand on his shoulder, physically turning him toward the front door. The man who had spent 5 years enjoying the luxury lifestyle my hard work provided was marched out of my house wearing nothing but a sweat-soaked athletic shirt and gym shorts. He did not even have his phone. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, severing him from my life forever. I stood alone in my sprawling kitchen, breathing in the sudden sharp silence. I knew they would not stop here. The first battle was successfully won, but the brutal, calculated war for my ultimate survival and absolute vengeance had barely begun. The morning sun had barely crested the Chicago skyline when I opened my laptop at the kitchen island. I had not slept a single minute. Instead, I had brewed a fresh pot of black coffee and drafted a meticulous timeline of my family's malicious actions. My absolute first priority was securing ruthless legal representation. I needed a shark, someone who specialized in unraveling complex corporate fraud and hostile family takeovers. I knew exactly who to call for this unprecedented disaster. At precisely 7 o'clock, I submitted an online intake form for one of the most feared litigation firms in the city, accompanied by a request to process a $50,000 retainer fee immediately. I typed in my primary platinum credit card details, clicked confirm, and reached for my coffee mug. A bright red error message flashed across the screen. Transaction declined. I frowned, setting this mug down. I pulled a different card from my wallet, a high-limit business expense card tied to my personal name, and entered the numbers. Declined. A cold prickle of alarm ran down my spine. I immediately opened a new tab and logged directly into my primary banking portal. The dashboard loaded, but the balances were entirely grayed out. Across the top of the screen, a glaring red banner read, "Accounts temporarily frozen pending legal review. Reason code conservatorship petition, mental incompetence." My breath caught in my throat. They had not just tried to steal my company. They had actually filed those forged documents with my bank to lock me out of my own money, successfully painting me as a psychologically unstable woman who needed her finances managed by her loving parents and devoted husband. It was a classic, devastating tactic used to paralyze a target before they could mount a defense. Without capital, I could not hire a lawyer. Without a lawyer, their fraudulent claims would go unchallenged in court. They thought they had entirely crippled me. They forgot they were dealing with someone whose entire career was built on anticipating worst-case scenarios. While my primary accounts were locked, they knew nothing about the encrypted offshore emergency fund I had established 3 years ago for exactly this kind of catastrophic event. I quickly activated a secure virtual private network, bypassed the standard banking channels, and successfully routed the retainer fee to the law firm using an untraceable limited liability company I controlled. The financial ambush was deeply unsettling, but it was not a fatal blow. It was simply an annoyance. As the confirmation receipt hit my encrypted inbox, my cell phone vibrated on the marble counter. The caller ID showed an unknown number. I accepted the call, putting it on speakerphone while I closed my banking tabs. "Good morning," Lauren Gavin's voice drifted out of the speaker. He sounded remarkably smug for a man who had been escorted out of his own home in gym shorts less than 24 hours ago. "I assume you have checked your bank accounts by now." I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the cool stone counter. "Are you calling to confess to bank fraud on a recorded line, Gavin? Or did you just borrow a phone to gloat?" "You always were too smart for your own good," he chuckled, though the sound was tight and nervous. "But smart does not matter when you cannot pay for a lawyer. Your parents and I filed the paperwork yesterday afternoon. By the time a judge reviews the footage you showed the cops, Aegis Communications will be entirely liquidated and Brittany Charity will be saved. We just needed you out of the way for a few days. You brought this on yourself by refusing to help family. If you just drop the police report and cooperate, we can undo the freeze. We can get you the psychiatric help you need." The sheer audacity of his manipulation ignited a quiet, focused rage deep inside me. He was still trying to play the benevolent savior, still trying to gaslight me into submission. "You really believe you hold the cards here?" I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper. "You think locking my checking account makes you a mastermind? But let us talk about your brilliant financial strategies, Gavin. Let us rewind exactly 5 years. Do you remember our first house, the starter home in Lincoln Park?" Silence hung on the line for a moment. "What does that have to do with anything?" He muttered, his fake confidence slipping. "It has everything to do with this." I fired back, my words striking like surgical blades. "Because 5 years ago you decided you were a genius investor. You forged my signature on a second mortgage to funnel $100,000 into a tech startup that went bankrupt in 2 months. You risked my home and my credit to play the big shot. When the bank came knocking, did you step up? Did you fix it? No. You cried on the kitchen floor like a child." I heard him exhale sharply, but I did not stop. I refused to let him interrupt. "I worked 80 hours a week for 2 straight years to save us from the ruin you created," I continued relentlessly. "I took on every nightmare crisis management client in the city. I missed holidays. I missed sleep. I missed my own life to pay off the debt you secretly racked up. I built my empire out of the ashes of your absolute incompetence. You have never been a provider, Gavin. You have always been a parasite. You attached yourself to my success because you are entirely incapable of generating your own. Lauren, shut up. He snapped, his voice trembling with humiliated rage. And now I pressed on, ignoring his outburst. You have teamed up with my toxic parents to steal a public relations firm you do not even know how to run, all to bail out my sister, another parasite who has never worked a real day in her life. You honestly think a frozen bank account is going to stop me? I survived your financial abuse once. This time I am not just going to survive. I am going to obliterate you entirely. I ended the call before he could utter a single syllable in response. My hands were perfectly steady. The adrenaline pumping through my veins felt sharp and clean. Gavin and my parents had just declared total war, relying on a playbook of manipulation and theft they thought was foolproof. But they had vastly underestimated the monster they had created. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my securely encrypted contacts, and dialed the exact number for Mr. Harrison, the most ruthless corporate litigator in Chicago. It was time to show them what an actual crisis looked like. After concluding my call with Mr. Harrison, I grabbed my keys and drove straight into the heart of downtown Chicago. The morning traffic was dense, a sea of brake lights and blaring horns, but I navigated it with absolute mechanical precision. My mind was already mapping out the legal battleground. Aegis Communications occupied the entire 14th floor of a premier high-rise overlooking the Chicago River. I had negotiated that commercial lease myself. I had personally chosen the imported Italian marble for the reception desk. I had hired every single employee currently sitting at their desks. I expected a fight when I arrived, but I underestimated exactly how fast a desperate family could move when a multi-million-dollar payday was on the line. I parked in my reserved underground spot and took the private executive elevator up to the main lobby level. The moment the steel doors slid open, I knew the hostile takeover was fully underway. Standing squarely in front of the primary security turnstiles were two massive unfamiliar men in cheap black suits. They were private security guards clearly hired through a third-party vendor overnight. My regular building staff, men and women I greeted by name every single morning, were nowhere to be seen. I stepped out of the elevator, my heels clicking sharply against the polished granite floor. The larger of the two guards immediately stepped forward, holding up a thick hand to block my path. "Ma'am," the guard said, his voice flat and practiced, "we have strict orders that you are no longer permitted on these premises. If you do not leave, we are authorized to call local law enforcement and have you removed for criminal trespassing." I stared at his generic security badge, processing the sheer audacity of the situation. Gavin and my parents had not just frozen my bank accounts. They had physically barred me from my own corporate headquarters. Before I could respond, the chime of the main lobby elevator echoed through the cavernous space. The polished brass doors glided open, and out stepped my younger sister, Brittany. At 30 years old, Brittany was the textbook definition of a failed lifestyle influencer. She was dripping in designer logos, clutching a ridiculous pastel handbag, and wearing an oversized beige blazer that she likely thought made her look like a serious business executive. She strutted past the security turnstiles with an unearned, sickening level of arrogance. Behind her trailed three of my senior account managers, all of them looking deeply uncomfortable and terrified for their jobs. Brittany stopped a few feet away from me, crossing her arms and letting out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet lobby. "I am so glad you came, Lauren," Brittany sneered, her voice dripping with fake pity. "I wanted to tell you personally that your services are no longer required here. The board has voted, and I am the new Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Communications. We are taking the company brand in a much more holistic, wellness-oriented direction." It was genuinely laughable. Brittany had never managed anything more complex than a social media calendar, yet here she was standing in the lobby of a corporate powerhouse pretending she had the intellectual capacity to run it. She had absolutely no idea what kind of sophisticated legal structures and heavy financial burdens actually kept this company operating on a daily basis. She just wanted the prestige. I looked at the employees standing behind her. They were avoiding my gaze, staring awkwardly at their shoes. They knew I built this company, but they also knew Brittany currently held the legal paperwork dictating their payroll. They were hostages in my family hostile takeover. "You are clearly unwell," Lauren Brittany continued loudly, making absolutely sure the entire lobby could hear her performance. "Mom and Dad have been worried sick about your severe mental decline. You have been pushing yourself too hard for years. You need to stop fighting us, go home, and finally check into a psych ward to get the heavy medication you desperately need. We are only doing this because we love you." The sheer delusion of her statement hung in the air. This was the golden child, the daughter who had been shielded from every single consequence her entire life. Our parents had spent decades smoothing over her failures, paying off her debts, and blaming everyone else for her glaring incompetence. Now they had handed her my multi-million-dollar firm on a silver platter, hoping she could just play CEO for the cameras while they liquidated my assets in the background. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The security guards tensed, but I did not raise my hands. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at my sister with a stare so perfectly cold that her smug smile began to physically falter. "A wellness-oriented direction?" I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue with absolute disgust. "That is a fascinating business strategy, Brittany. Tell me, how exactly do you plan to run a top-tier crisis management firm when you cannot even manage to format a basic email without using spell check?" Brittany's face flushed an ugly, patchy red. "How dare you?" she stammered, glancing back at the employees. "I am the owner now." "You are a parasite wearing a stolen blazer," I fired back, my voice slicing through the lobby like a scalpel. "Do not stand there and lecture me about mental health and family love. Let us talk about real family sacrifices. Let us talk about how 12 years ago, Mom and Dad sat me down at the kitchen table and forced me to give up my entire college savings fund. They drained my tuition money so you could go study fashion in Europe, claiming it was your grand destiny." The lobby was dead silent. Even the security guards were staring at Brittany now. "And what did you do with my tuition money, Brittany?" I demanded, stepping even closer. "You partied in Paris for exactly 3 months, failed every single introductory class, and dropped out to follow a completely unemployed aspiring DJ to Ibiza. You blew my entire educational future on cheap champagne and bad decisions. You have never succeeded at a single thing in your entire 30 years of existence. You fail, and Mommy and Daddy steal from me to cover your tracks. That is the only business model you actually understand." "Shut up!" Brittany shrieked, her influencer facade completely shattering. She pointed a trembling finger at the guards. "Remove her right now. Throw her out on the street." "You do not need to throw me anywhere," I said, maintaining my flawless composure as I adjusted my handbag strap on my shoulder. "I am leaving. Enjoy your new title, Brittany. Playing pretend in my office is the closest thing to success you will ever experience." I turned on my heel and walked deliberately toward the revolving glass doors. The sheer silence of the lobby followed me out. The employees who had been forced to stand behind her were now exchanging nervous, knowing glances. They recognized exactly who the real power in that room was, and it was certainly not the woman throwing a temper tantrum by the elevators. I did not look back. I had been completely stripped of my daily assets, locked out of my own building, and publicly humiliated by the sister who stole my life. But I was not broken. As I stepped out into the freezing Chicago wind, a terrifying, absolute calm washed over me. They thought they had won the war by capturing a single building. They had no idea I was about to burn the entire city to the ground. The freezing Chicago wind bit through my thin trench coat as I walked 3 blocks from the corporate high-rise that used to be mine. I ducked into a dilapidated corner diner, the kind with sticky vinyl booths and the overwhelming smell of stale grease. Sliding into a booth near the back, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill. It was the only untraceable cash I had on me. Everything else, the black cards, the corporate accounts, the joint savings, was locked behind Gavin and my parents' fraudulent legal firewall. A waitress in a faded apron poured a cup of black coffee in front of me without asking. I stared at the dark liquid, letting the sheer magnitude of my isolation sink in. I was completely cut off. My husband had betrayed me. My parents had orchestrated my financial ruin. My sister was currently sitting in my custom leather chair, playing chief executive officer with my life work. I had $20 to my name and a war to plan. My cell phone vibrated violently against the cheap Formica table. I glanced at the screen, fully expecting another gloating text from Gavin or a fake wellness check from my mother. Instead, the caller ID displayed a name that made me pause. Jamal. He was Brittany's husband. At 34 years old, Jamal was a brilliant, highly successful forensic accountant. As an African American man who had built his own wealth through sheer intellect and flawless ethical standards, he had always stood out in stark contrast to my superficial status, obsessed family. At our chaotic holiday dinners, while my parents boasted and Brittany whined about her lack of followers, Jamal usually sat quietly at the edge of the table, observing everything with sharp, calculating eyes. We rarely spoke deeply, but there was always a mutual, unspoken respect between us. We were the only two people in that family who actually worked for a living. I picked up the phone, bracing myself for a demand that I apologized to his wife. "Hello, Jamal," I answered, keeping my tone carefully neutral. "Lauren," his voice was sharp, hushed, and completely devoid of his usual calm demeanor. "Are you alone right now?" I looked around the empty diner. "Yes." "Good," he replied quickly. "I need to see you immediately. Do not go back to your house. Do not contact Gavin. Text me the address of where you are sitting right now. I need 10 minutes. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Jamal, if Brittany sent you to negotiate a surrender, you are wasting your time. I am not calling on behalf of your sister Lauren. I am calling because I just tore apart my family financial records, and we have a massive catastrophic problem. Do not move." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my crisis management instincts immediately kicking into overdrive. If Jamal, a man whose entire career revolved around tracking hidden corporate assets and uncovering white-collar crimes, was panicking, the situation was far worse than a simple hostile takeover. Exactly 11 minutes later, the diner bell chimed. Jamal walked through the door. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched tight. He carried a thick, heavy leather briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand. He spotted me in the back booth and strode over, sliding into the vinyl seat opposite me. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer empty sympathies about my company or my home. He completely bypassed all family pleasantries. "Have you eaten?" he asked, signaling the waitress and dropping a crisp $50 bill on the table. "Bring us a fresh pot of coffee and whatever she wants. Keep the change and give us some privacy." The waitress nodded instantly, retreating to the other side of the room. Jamal placed the heavy leather briefcase flat on the table between us. He snapped the twin brass locks open, the sound sharp like a gunshot in the quiet diner. "I know what they did to you this morning, Lauren." Jamal said, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a chill through my blood. "I know about the forged corporate transfer. I know about the eviction notice. I know your accounts are frozen." I blinked, genuinely surprised. "How could you possibly know all of that?" "Because I spent the last 48 hours auditing my own wife," he stated flatly. Jamal pulled a massive stack of bank statements, wire transfer logs, and encrypted communication printouts from his briefcase. He laid them out across the sticky table with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a federal indictment. "You and I have always been the outsiders in this family, Lauren. You were the workhorse they milked for cash, and I was the respectable professional they used to make Brittany look like a stable adult. But I am a forensic accountant. My literal job is to follow the money when people try to hide it. I do not do blind trust. I verify." 3 days ago, he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Leaning over the documents, I noticed a subtle anomaly in one of the joint investment accounts I share with Brittany. A small, seemingly insignificant routing error that any normal person would dismiss as a banking glitch. But it bothered me. It was sloppy. So I ran a deep diagnostic on every single asset attached to my household. I pulled the data on Brittany personal accounts, our joint holdings, and most importantly, the protected educational trusts I set up for our two children. Jamal's hands were completely steady, but a muscle in his jaw twitched violently. He slid a highlighted bank statement toward me. I looked down at the paper, my eyes scanning the highlighted rows of numbers. What I saw made the blood drain from my face. This was not a minor discrepancy. It was a systematic, massive hemorrhage of funds. It was a digital bloodbath. "What is this, Jamal?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. That Jamal replied, his tone dripping with a terrifying, calculated rage, is a perfectly executed theft. Brittany did not just steal your company today, Lauren. She has been stealing from our own children for months, and she has not been doing it alone. I stared at the highlighted rows of numbers, my mind struggling to process the sheer volume of capital that had vanished. It was a perfectly executed digital bleed hidden beneath layers of shell transactions and fake vendor payments. $2 million, I whispered, tracing the final balance with my index finger. Jamal, this is your children's entire educational trust. This is their future. Who else is on these routing numbers? Jamal reached into his briefcase and withdrew a second folder. He placed it squarely on top of the bank statements. He did not blink. He did not waver. He simply delivered the final fatal blow to my marriage. "I tracked the destination accounts," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Brittany was not buying designer handbags or wellness retreats with this money. She was funneling it into a series of offshore holding accounts. Accounts that I spent the last 12 hours tracing directly back to a highly illegal underground sports betting syndicate. And the person placing those bets, the person holding the encryption keys to those offshore accounts, is your husband. I stopped breathing. The diner around me seemed to blur into white noise. The clatter of coffee cups, the hum of the old refrigerator, the chatter of the few patrons left in the building all faded away into a vacuum of absolute silence. "Gavin." Jamal nodded slowly. "Gavin. They have been sleeping together for over 8 months, Lauren." I pulled the hotel receipts, the encrypted text logs, the private flights they booked using dummy corporations. "Your husband and my wife have been carrying on a full-blown affair right under our noses. But Gavin is not just a cheater. He is a degenerate gambling addict. He got in far too deep with some very dangerous people. He owed them over $2 million. When they threatened to break his legs, he manipulated Brittany into raiding our children's trust funds to save his own life. The sheer depravity of it hit me like a physical blow. Gavin had not just been unfaithful. He had actively conspired with my own sister to steal from her children, to steal from an innocent family, simply to cover his own catastrophic failures. It was a level of sociopathic behavior I had never anticipated, even from him. But how does this connect to my company? I asked, my crisis management brain rapidly piecing the timeline together. Why steal Aegis Communications today? If they already stole your money, what do they need my business for right this second? Jamal reached into the very bottom of his briefcase. He pulled out a single sheet of paper protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. "Because I am a forensic accountant, Lauren. I conduct a mandatory comprehensive audit of my own family finances every single year on the first of the month. That audit is exactly 5 days away." He slid the plastic sleeve across the sticky table. It was a printed email. The header indicated it had been sent securely from my mother's email address to my father, with Gavin carbon copied. "I intercepted this from your parents' private home server last night," Jamal explained, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. "I knew something was wrong, so I bypassed their basic security firewalls. Read it." I picked up the paper. The words printed on the page were so vile, so completely devoid of basic human decency, that my blood ran cold. The email detailed exactly how my parents had discovered the affair and the stolen $2 million. Gavin had confessed to them 2 weeks ago when he realized Jamal's annual audit was looming. He told them that if Jamal discovered the missing money, Jamal would absolutely press federal charges. Brittany would go to prison for embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The golden child, the perfect daughter they had spent 30 years protecting, would become a convicted felon. Instead of forcing Brittany to face the consequences of her crimes, my parents had devised a sickening solution. The email outlined the entire hostile takeover of my life. They could not raise $2 million in cash quietly without triggering red flags. But Lauren has a highly profitable public relations firm my mother had written. Aegis Communications is valued at over $5 million. If we secure power of attorney and transfer ownership to Brittany, we can immediately liquidate the firm corporate assets, sell off the client list to a competitor, and replace the missing $2 million in Jamal trust accounts before he ever runs his audit. Lauren will be furious, but we can have Gavin freeze her out, label her as mentally unstable, and force her to start over. She has always been resilient. She will survive. Brittany cannot survive prison. I read the final sentence 3 times. She has always been resilient. She will survive. Brittany cannot survive prison. They were willing to completely destroy my life, strip me of my life work, and leave me absolutely destitute just to protect Brittany from the consequences of stealing from her own children. I was nothing but collateral damage to them. I was a human shield they could throw in front of a federal indictment to keep their golden child out of a jail cell. The fact that my own mother could write those words, calmly calculating my total ruin as a necessary sacrifice, shattered whatever fragile illusion of family I had left. Jamal watched my face as the horrifying reality settled in. "They sacrificed you to save her," he said, his voice entirely steady, masking the deep betrayal he must have been feeling regarding his own marriage. "They orchestrated the forgery, the eviction, and the asset freeze to keep you paralyzed while they tried to sell your company from under you. If they pull it off, they replace the money. I suspect nothing during my audit, and Brittany walks away clean while you lose everything." I placed the intercepted email gently back onto the table. The sudden violent rage I had felt earlier in my kitchen was completely gone. In its place was a chilling, absolute clarity. My parents, my sister, and my husband had formed a criminal syndicate designed to ruin me. They thought they could break me down, label me as insane, and quietly profit off my destruction. They had vastly underestimated the intelligence of the 2 people they had betrayed. I looked up at Jamal, the forensic accountant who had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle my entire toxic family. He did not look broken by his wife's infidelity. He looked like a man ready to go to war. We were 2 outcasts, bound together by the ultimate deception, holding the blueprints to their destruction. "They think they have a foolproof plan," I said, my voice barely a whisper but laced with lethal intent. "They think they stole a gold mine." Jamal leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine, his hands folding neatly over his briefcase. "So what is our next move, Lauren? Because I am not just going to divorce her. I am going to make sure every single one of them faces federal charges. I want them ruined." I reached across the table and tapped the forged transfer agreement for Aegis Communications. "They wanted my company, Jamal. I think it is time we let them have it." Jamal leaned back against the cracked vinyl of the diner booth, a slow, dangerous smile breaking through his normally stoic expression. "You want to hand them the keys to the castle?" he said, his voice a low rumble of absolute comprehension. "You want them to walk right through the front door and lock it behind themselves before they realize the building is rigged to detonate." "Exactly," I replied, matching his cold intensity. "My parents and Gavin are relying on my predictable reaction. They expect me to hire lawyers immediately to scream to fight them in the courts for months over the forged transfer documents. That is what a normal person would do when everything they own is stolen. But if I fight them right now, it creates a prolonged legal battle. It gives Gavin time to hide his offshore accounts. It gives my mother time to play the victim to the press. And most importantly, it prevents Brittany from officially executing any actions as the new chief executive officer of Aegis Communications. We cannot let that happen. We need them to feel completely invincible. We need them to operate with zero fear of retaliation." Jamal nodded, his brilliant analytical mind already racing ahead to the financial implications. "If they think you have surrendered," he said, tapping his pen against the thick stack of bank statements, "they will accelerate their timeline. Gavin owes a violent sports betting syndicate $2 million. My parents are terrified of my upcoming household audit. They do not have time to sit on your company. They need to liquidate its assets and drain its operating capital immediately to replace the money Brittany stole from my children. They are going to throw a massive celebration to establish legitimacy, I added, pulling out a small notepad from my purse. My mother thrives on public validation. She will want to parade Brittany around Chicago high society to prove her golden child is a brilliant corporate executive. They will invite investors, media, and every elite contact in their social circle to legitimize the hostile takeover. That is where we will strike. A crisis public relations manager and a forensic accountant. They have absolutely no idea the level of professional destruction they just invited into their lives. We shook hands across the sticky table, forging a pact built on the ashes of our shattered marriages. There was no hesitation, no lingering loyalty to the people who had viewed us as nothing more than disposable assets. Jamal agreed to quietly secure every single digital footprint Gavin and Brittany had left behind. He would compile the wire transfers, the offshore routing numbers, and the encrypted messages into an airtight federal dossier. My job was to handle the narrative. I needed to feed my toxic family the exact psychological victory they desperately craved, so they would drop every single defensive barrier they had. I pulled out my cell phone and opened my encrypted messaging application. I navigated to the group chat that included my mother, my father, and Gavin. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. "What are you doing?" Jamal asked, watching my face carefully. "I am writing a script," I replied, my eyes fixed on the screen. In crisis management, when you are dealing with narcissists, you never attack their ego directly. You feed it until it bursts. My mother and Gavin need to believe they successfully broke my mind. They need to see me as a hysterical, defeated woman who has finally accepted her place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I am going to give them a performance worthy of an Academy Award. I began to type carefully, selecting every single word to inflict maximum psychological comfort on my enemies. I did not use perfect grammar. I intentionally added typos and erratic spacing to simulate a complete mental breakdown. Mom, Dad, Gavin. I typed, forcing my hands to remain perfectly steady. I am so sorry. You were right. I am completely overwhelmed and my mind is not working correctly. I have been pushing myself too hard for years and everything is falling apart. I cannot fight anymore. I do not want to fight anymore. I just want peace. Please keep the company, keep the house. Brittany can have Aegis. I know she will do great things with it. I am checking myself into a private wellness retreat to get the psychiatric help you suggested. Please do not try to contact me. I need to be completely alone to heal. I surrender. I am so sorry for everything. I read the message aloud to Jamal. He raised his eyebrows in profound appreciation. It is pathetic, he noted, shaking his head. It is entirely desperate, thoroughly defeated, and utterly embarrassing. It is exactly what they want to hear, I confirmed. My mother will print this out and frame it. Gavin will use it to prove to the bank that his conservatorship petition was entirely justified. They will read this and pop open a bottle of champagne, believing they just executed the perfect crime without a single drop of blood spilled. I took a deep breath, locking away my pride, and pressed send. The message delivered instantly. We sat in silence, watching the screen. Less than 30 seconds later, the red receipts appeared. My mother, my father, and Gavin had all viewed the message simultaneously. They were likely sitting in the same room, celebrating my absolute destruction. A minute passed. Then a single reply came through from my mother. It read, "We forgive you, Lauren. Please get the help you need. We will take it from here." I locked my phone and slid it across the table toward Jamal. The trap was officially set. My family had swallowed the bait whole, completely unaware that the company they just stole was a ticking time bomb, and the daughter they just discarded was holding the detonator. I looked at Jamal, the only true family I had left in the world. "It is time to call Mr. Harrison," I said, a cold, genuine smile finally reaching my eyes. "Let us go prepare a proper corporate reception." Over the next 48 hours, my family wasted absolutely zero time cementing their false narrative. Operating from an undisclosed hotel room paid for by my offshore account, I purchased a cheap burner phone specifically to monitor their digital footprint. I sat at a small desk by the window, watching my own public execution unfold in real time across every major social media platform. My mother, Patricia, initiated the strike. She posted a meticulously crafted 5-paragraph essay on Facebook alongside a heartbreaking photo of us from 10 years ago. The caption was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. She wrote, "Please keep our beloved Lauren in your daily prayers." The intense pressure of running a corporate agency has unfortunately triggered a severe mental health crisis. Our family is rallying together to ensure she receives the intensive psychiatric care she desperately needs during this dark season. We ask for privacy while we step in to carry her heavy burdens. The post generated hundreds of sympathetic comments within an hour. Country club acquaintances, distant relatives, and corporate partners flooded the comment section with prayers and words of encouragement for my incredibly brave parents. Gavin quickly followed suit. He updated his professional networking profile with an equally nauseating statement. He announced he was taking a temporary step back from his hedge fund duties to focus entirely on supporting his deeply troubled wife. He shamelessly positioned himself as the ultimate devoted husband, a martyr sacrificing his own career to care for a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. But Brittany, true to her nature as a failed lifestyle influencer, took the performance to an entirely new, grotesque level. She posted a highly produced, heavily filtered video to her massive online following. In the video, she wore minimal makeup to appear somber and wiped away fake tears as she spoke directly to the camera. "It breaks my heart to see my big sister suffer." Brittany sniffled for her audience, but family always steps up. That is why I am officially stepping in as the new Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Communications. I am putting my own wellness brand on hold to save Lauren Company from collapsing. It is a massive sacrifice, but I will do whatever it takes to protect my sister's legacy while she heals in a secure facility. She even had the audacity to start a custom hashtag prayers for Lauren and urged her followers to share it. The sheer sociopathic brilliance of their combined public relations strategy was almost impressive. By publicly declaring me legally insane and emotionally shattered, they completely insulated themselves from any future accusations. If I suddenly emerged and claimed they stole my business, everyone would simply shake their heads, pity me, and assume it was just another tragic delusion of a sick woman refusing to accept help. They were so utterly convinced of their total victory that they decided a simple digital announcement was not enough. My parents immediately sent out invitations for a lavish engagement-style celebration. They booked the grand ballroom at a luxury country club for that coming Saturday night. The invitation touted a celebration of new beginnings and officially welcomed Brittany as the dynamic new leader of Chicago premier public relations firm. They invited investors, local politicians, and media contacts. They were spending thousands of dollars of stolen money to throw a coronation ceremony for a thief. While they were busy tasting catering menus, ordering floral arrangements, and popping expensive champagne, they completely ignored the quiet, methodical threat operating directly in their blind spot. Across the city, locked inside his secure basement home office, Jamal was executing a digital massacre. Jamal sat illuminated by the cold blue light of 3 massive computer monitors. As a certified forensic accountant with high-level clearance, he possessed software tools that could track a single penny across the globe. He did not need to break down doors or shout to destroy Gavin. He only needed his keyboard and a steady supply of black coffee. Gavin thought he was a financial genius because he knew how to move money through standard offshore shell companies. He had routed the $2 million stolen from Jamal children through a series of dummy corporations based in the Cayman Islands, filtering the cash before dropping it into an underground sports betting syndicate. To an average bank teller, the trail looked like a series of complex, legitimate corporate investments. To Jamal, the trail looked like a brightly lit runway. Working in absolute silence while his wife Brittany was out shopping for a designer dress for her upcoming coronation party, Jamal meticulously unraveled every single layer of Gavin financial deception. He pulled the digital routing numbers, the exact timestamps of the wire transfers, and the matching internet protocol addresses Gavin had used to authorize the theft from his home laptop. Jamal documented the exact moments Brittany logged into the children educational trusts to authorize the withdrawal of funds. Jamal did not stop at the theft. He dug deeper into the underground betting syndicate. He uncovered the specific, highly illegal gambling accounts Gavin was funding. He linked those accounts to known organized crime figures operating out of Nevada and offshore territories. Gavin had essentially committed massive wire fraud across state and international lines, instantly elevating his crimes from a simple family dispute to a severe federal offense. Jamal compiled every bank statement, every hidden transaction, and every intercepted email into a flawless, heavily encrypted digital dossier. He created an airtight package designed specifically for federal authorities. It contained no emotion, no assumptions, and no guesswork. It was pure, undeniable, devastating financial data. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Gavin and Brittany had committed felony embezzlement, grand larceny, and federal wire fraud, and that Richard and Patricia were active, knowing accomplices attempting to cover up a federal crime. We communicated strictly through encrypted messaging throughout the process. When Jamal finally hit send on his last secure query, he texted me a single confirming message. "The financial autopsy is complete. I have every single transaction documented. The federal package is locked and ready for delivery." I smiled at the screen. My family was busy ordering ice sculptures and rehearsing their fake sympathetic speeches for their upcoming gala. They thought they had successfully buried me alive. They were completely unaware that while they decorated the ballroom for a celebration, Jamal and I had just finished constructing the very federal prison cells they would spend the next decade living inside. 2 days before the Grand Country Club Gala, Jamal and I met late at night in a secure windowless conference room I had rented under a fake name in the South Loop. The only light came from the harsh glow of his laptop screen and a single fluorescent bulb buzzing above us. The table was covered in his meticulously organized financial dossiers. We had Gavin trapped in a federal wire fraud net, and my parents cornered as active accomplices. But Jamal still looked worried about my professional future. "The federal charges will put them behind bars," Jamal said, leaning back and rubbing his tired eyes. "But the forged transfer documents they filed for Aegis Communications are currently legally binding. Until a judge officially overturns the forgery, Brittany technically holds the keys to your public relations firm. She has access to your operating capital. She can sell off your client list to a competitor tomorrow to raise the $2 million she stole from my kids. We need to file an emergency injunction to freeze Aegis before she liquidates your life work." I sat across from him, perfectly still. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thin manila folder. I slid it across the smooth table until it rested on top of his stack of federal evidence. "Jamal," I said, my voice completely calm, "you do not need to file an injunction. Let Brittany keep Aegis Communications. I do not want it back." Jamal stared at me, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Lauren, Aegis is valued at over $5 million. You built that company from scratch. You cannot just let them have it." "I am not letting them have a $5 million company," I replied, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the table. "I am letting them have a hollow, worthless piece of paper. Open the folder." Jamal opened the manila envelope. Inside were 3 pages of corporate registration documents and commercial licensing agreements. He scanned the first page, his eyes darting quickly across the dense legal text. As a forensic accountant, it took his brilliant mind only seconds to understand what he was looking at. He stopped reading, looking up at me in absolute shock. "You hollowed it out," Jamal whispered, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across his face. 3 years ago," I explained. "After Gavin secretly forged my signature on that second mortgage and nearly bankrupted us to fund his failed startup, I learned a permanent lesson. I realized I was sleeping next to a financial predator. I knew I could never fully trust him with my assets again. But instead of divorcing him right then and dealing with a messy split of my business, I quietly hired a corporate restructuring attorney." I pointed to the second page in the folder. "I formed a holding company in Delaware called Vanguard Strategic Holdings. It is a blind, limited liability company. My name does not appear on any public registry, but I own it 100%. The day Vanguard was established, I systematically transferred every single valuable asset out of Aegis Communications and placed it directly into the holding company. Jamal looked back down at the paperwork, reading the specific clauses I had highlighted. The intellectual property, he noted, his voice filled with profound admiration. The proprietary crisis management software your firm uses, the trademarks, the branding. You moved all of it, everything, I confirmed. Aegis Communications does not own a single piece of software. It does not own the logo on the front door. It does not even own the custom marble reception desk in the lobby. Aegis simply leases those assets from Vanguard Strategic Holdings on a month-to-month basis. But the best part is the client list. I slid a standard client contract across the table. My VIP clients are massive tech conglomerates and politicians. They hired me for my specific expertise. When I restructured, I updated every master service agreement. My clients do not technically hold contracts with Aegis. Their legally binding contracts are exclusively held by Vanguard Strategic Holdings. Aegis merely acts as a third-party servicing vendor. Jamal let out a low whistle, running a hand over his mouth as the sheer brilliance of the trap fully materialized in his mind. So when Brittany and your parents forged those documents to take over Aegis, they thought they were stealing a gold mine. They thought they were capturing a cash cow they could quickly butcher to replace the stolen trust fund money. Exactly, I said, my smile turning sharp. They thought they stole my empire. In reality, they stole an empty cardboard box with a fancy label printed on the side. Aegis has zero tangible assets, and because the service agreements contain a strict key personnel clause, the moment I was officially removed as active director, every single one of those VIP client contracts automatically voided. I checked my watch. As of 8 o'clock this morning, my transition team began quietly contacting every major client on the roster. We informed them Aegis was undergoing a hostile shift in management and activated their transition clauses. By tomorrow afternoon, 100% of the client base will have officially signed new contracts directly with Vanguard. Jamal sat back in absolute awe. Brittany is going to walk into that country club gala, posing as a powerful chief executive officer. She is going to stand in front of investors and Chicago elite bragging about taking over your massive corporate empire. And she will be the proud owner of absolutely nothing. I finished for him. She stole a company that generates zero revenue, holds zero contracts, and possesses zero assets. She committed federal forgery just to inherit an empty shell. This is beautiful, Jamal said, looking at me with unwavering respect. They dug their own graves, climbed inside, and you just handed them the shovels. I am not quite finished handing out the heavy shovels, I replied, staring back into his dark eyes. They thought they had crippled me by seizing an empty corporate entity, but they failed to comprehend the terrifying financial burdens attached to it. The second phase of my retaliation was about to begin, and it would ensure that they could never recover from their incredible betrayal. The second phase of my retaliation was about to begin, and it would ensure that they could never recover from their incredible betrayal. I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out a second, significantly thicker manila folder. I placed it on the table right next to the corporate restructuring documents. Jamal stared silently at the heavy envelope. There is more, he asked, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. When you manage corporate crises for a living, I explained, leaning back in my chair, you learn that the most effective traps do not just lock the doors, they entirely collapse the ceiling. Stealing an empty shell company is a humiliating defeat for Brittany and Gavin. But humiliation does not pay the bills, and it certainly does not put them behind bars. I needed a poison pill. Something so incredibly toxic that the moment they swallowed it, their financial existence would be permanently destroyed. I opened the heavy folder and slid a highly classified, official government document toward him. It bore the unmistakable, terrifying seal of the Internal Revenue Service. Jamal leaned forward, his forensic accountant instincts immediately taking over. His eyes scanned the dense blocks of text, the penalty codes, and the final bolded numbers at the bottom of the last page. I watched his breathing stop completely. Lauren, Jamal whispered, looking up at me with an expression of pure reverence. This is a notice of extreme federal tax liability. This is an active pending audit penalty. Exactly. I smiled, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. When I restructured my business 3 years ago to protect my assets from Gavin, I did not just move the profitable contracts and intellectual property over to Vanguard Strategic Holdings. I also had my legal team execute a highly aggressive, complex series of corporate tax maneuvers. We deliberately pushed every single allowable deduction, deferred massive tax burdens, and structured the corporate accounting so that Aegis Communications absorbed all the severe tax liabilities, while Vanguard remained perfectly clean. You turned Aegis into a corporate sponge for federal debt. Jamal said, his fingers tracing the staggering total at the bottom of the IRS letter. $4 million. Aegis Communications owes the federal government $4 million in back taxes, accrued penalties, and audit fines. It gets better. I continued, leaning over the table to tap the specific liability clause. Aegis is registered as a pass-through entity. That means the corporate tax debt does not just belong to the business. It passes directly through to the primary owner and chief executive officer. Until yesterday morning, that was me. My legal team and I have been quietly battling this specific audit for the past 8 months. We were preparing to settle the debt using funds I had safely secured in a separate account. It was a calculated risk I took to protect my true wealth. But then my loving family decided to execute a hostile takeover. Jamal let out a loud, echoing laugh that filled the small, windowless conference room. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with the sheer vindictive joy of the revelation. They forged your signature, he said, catching his breath. Brittany and Gavin actively conspired to forge federal transfer documents, effectively stripping you of your title and establishing Brittany as the sole owner and chief executive officer of Aegis Communications. They legally filed those papers with the state to lock you out of the building and freeze your bank accounts. Which means, I concluded, my voice razor sharp, by legally stealing my company. Brittany just legally assumed 100% of the $4 million federal tax debt. She did not steal a gold mine. She voluntarily signed up to be the primary target of an active IRS investigation. The brilliant beauty of the trap hung heavily in the air between us. Brittany and Gavin thought they were pulling off the heist of the century. They needed to quickly liquidate a $5 million public relations firm to replace the $2 million they had embezzled from your children. Instead, they had successfully stolen absolutely zero assets and instantly triggered a $4 million federal liability. When the IRS came to collect, they would not be looking for me. They would be looking directly at the woman proudly parading around Chicago as the new head of Aegis Communications. They are going to be annihilated, Jamal stated, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. Gavin owes a violent underground sports betting syndicate $2 million. He thinks he can pay them back by Friday. When he realizes Aegis is an empty shell, he will panic. But when the IRS freezes Brittany accounts to collect the $4 million tax debt, Gavin will have no way to hide. The mob will come for him, and the federal government will come for Brittany. And my parents, I added coldly, my parents will be caught right in the middle of the blast radius. They orchestrated the entire forgery to protect their golden child. They wrote that intercepted email explicitly planning to sacrifice my future to save Brittany from prison. When the federal authorities start investigating the forged transfer documents and the sudden shift in corporate liability, my parents will be indicted as active co-conspirators in a massive federal fraud scheme. They thought they were protecting their precious legacy. Instead, they have guaranteed their own absolute ruin. Jamal closed the manila folder and slid it back toward me. You are a terrifying woman, Lauren. I am profoundly glad we are on the same side. I protect those who are loyal, I replied, packing the deadly IRS document safely back into my leather tote. And I systematically, ruthlessly destroy those who are absolutely not. My family demanded a total war, Jamal. They brought forged documents and stolen money to the battlefield. I am bringing the full crushing weight of the United States federal government. Now we just need to ensure they celebrate their fake victory as loudly as possible. We absolutely must prepare our flawless trap for their upcoming anniversary gala this weekend. It will be a completely unforgettable night for everyone involved. The very next morning, I initiated the financial sequence that would fund my retaliation. Operating from my secure laptop in the temporary hotel room, I logged into a heavily encrypted portal routed through a server in Switzerland. Gavin and my parents believed they had successfully paralyzed me by freezing my domestic bank accounts, but they were entirely oblivious to the safety net I had constructed. I executed a series of complex verification protocols to legally unfreeze my offshore emergency trust. The simple act of watching my account balances populate with 7 figures of legitimate, untraceable capital felt like taking a deep breath after being held underwater for days. Within minutes, perfectly clean money flooded into a newly established domestic business account under Vanguard Strategic Holdings. The influx of cash felt like loading live ammunition into a weapon. I was no longer a helpless victim locked out of her own life. I was a heavily funded adversary preparing for a brutal corporate war. With my capital secured, I needed a legal executioner. I scheduled an immediate confidential meeting with Mr. Harrison. He was the most feared corporate litigator in Chicago, a man whose reputation for dismantling fraudulent enterprises was legendary in the financial district. He was a man who thrived on destroying arrogant executives, and his office walls were lined with the massive settlements of people who thought they were smarter than him. I walked into his imposing corner office overlooking Lake Michigan and laid the entire situation on his massive mahogany desk. I presented the forged corporate transfer documents, the fake eviction notice, the fraudulent divorce papers, and finally the explosive Internal Revenue Service tax liability attached to Aegis Communications. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses, his sharp eyes scanning the paperwork with predatory focus. When he reached the tax liability clause and realized what my family had unknowingly signed up for, a slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. "You essentially handed them a live grenade wrapped in a pretty bow," Mr. Harrison said, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. "The forgery alone is a federal offense, but assuming a $4 million tax debt while actively attempting to liquidate the company to cover gambling debts crosses into massive criminal conspiracy. They are going to face federal prison time." I nodded, confirming that was exactly the goal. I retained him on the spot, wiring a massive retainer fee directly into his firm operating account. We spent the next 4 hours mapping out a relentless legal strategy. Mr. Harrison began quietly drafting the civil suits, the restraining orders, and the official reports for the federal authorities. He coordinated directly with Jamal, who provided the forensic accounting evidence proving Gavin and Brittany had embezzled the $2 million from the children educational funds. Every single piece of evidence was meticulously cataloged, cross-referenced, and prepared for immediate deployment. Our coordination was absolute perfection. We needed a stage for the execution, and my parents graciously provided the perfect venue. They were hosting an extravagant gala that upcoming Saturday night at the Waldorf Astoria. It was ostensibly a celebration of their 35th wedding anniversary, but they had aggressively marketed the event as a grand coming-out party for Brittany. My burner phone buzzed constantly with updates from their public social media accounts. My mother was posting endless photos of floral arrangements, champagne pyramids, and custom ice sculptures. She was shamelessly using the sympathy from my fake mental breakdown to boost attendance. Her posts raved about how the family was coming together in a time of darkness to support Brittany as she bravely stepped up to become the new chief executive officer of Aegis Communications. They were spending tens of thousands of dollars of stolen money to fund this charade, convinced that their carefully constructed narrative of the tragic, mentally ill older sister and the heroic younger sister would cement their status in high society forever. They had invited over 300 guests, including top-tier investors, local politicians, and prominent Chicago media personalities. They wanted the entire city to witness their triumph. The sheer vanity of their plan was their ultimate vulnerability. They were gathering every single person they wanted to impress into one enclosed room. It was the absolute perfect kill box. Jamal and I finalized the tactical logistics of crashing the event. Jamal used his high-level security clearance to quietly bypass the hotel audiovisual network. He secured remote access to the massive projector screens that my parents planned to use for their celebratory slideshow. We tested the system twice, ensuring we could hijack the video feed from a mobile device the moment I gave the signal. We also coordinated security for Jamal's children. He arranged for his trusted sister to take the kids out of state for the weekend, completely removing them from the blast radius of the impending arrests. Brittany would have absolutely no leverage when the police finally arrived. As Saturday approached, the anticipation was electric. I visited an exclusive boutique on the Magnificent Mile, paying in cash for a stunning blood-red designer gown. If I was going to crash my own funeral and expose a criminal conspiracy in front of Chicago elite, I was going to do it looking absolutely flawless. I had spent my entire life being the responsible one, the workhorse who paid the bills and fixed the problems, while my parents showered Brittany with undeserved praise. That dynamic ended tonight. My family thought I was currently shivering in a psychiatric ward, broken and defeated by their brilliant manipulation. They thought they had secured their legacy, their stolen wealth, and their golden child future. They had no idea that Mr. Harrison had already notified the federal authorities, or that Jamal had handed over the exact offshore routing numbers, proving Gavin massive illegal gambling debts. Everything was locked into place. The trap was fully baited. The exits were blocked, and the timeline was counting down. The Century Gala was about to become the most spectacular public ruin in the history of the city. Saturday evening arrived with the unforgiving chill of a Chicago winter. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my hotel suite, staring at the woman looking back at me. I was no longer the exhausted, overworked wife who had opened a black box on her doorstep just a few days ago. The woman in the mirror was a completely different entity. I slipped into the blood-red designer gown. The heavy silk draped perfectly over my frame, the color acting as a deliberate blazing contrast to the sea of muted pastels and conservative black suits my parents mandated at their high society functions. It was not just a dress, it was armor. I applied my makeup with surgical precision, highlighting my sharp cheekbones and painting my lips a deep crimson. There would be no fake tears tonight. There would be no trembling hands or hysterical outbursts for my mother to weaponize against me. I secured my diamond earrings, the only pieces of jewelry I had managed to keep hidden from Gavin, and grabbed my clutch. Inside rested my phone, fully charged and preloaded with the digital command keys to hijack the Waldorf Astoria projector system. I took one final breath, letting the icy calm settle deep into my bones. My encrypted phone vibrated against the marble vanity. It was Jamal. I accepted the call, pressing the speaker against my ear. "Are we green?" I asked, my voice steady and completely void of hesitation. "We are absolute emerald," Jamal replied, the sharp tapping of his keyboard echoing through the receiver. I just intercepted Gavin's final panic move. 10 minutes ago, he tried to initiate a massive transfer from Aegis Communications to his offshore holding account in the Cayman Islands. He thought he was moving $500,000 of operating capital to stall the sports betting syndicate. But because Aegis is a completely empty shell, the transfer automatically bounced. The bank flagged the transaction immediately. I smiled at my reflection. Gavin was suffocating. "Did you secure the server logs?" I pulled the raw data packets directly from the banking firewall. Jamal confirmed, his tone radiating dark satisfaction. "It proves undeniable premeditated federal wire fraud." I sent the complete unredacted file directly to the lead federal investigator overseeing the embezzlement case. They have everything they need to execute the arrest warrant tonight. "How is Mr. Harrison?" "Harrison is already waiting in the lobby of the Waldorf," I said, grabbing my coat. "He brought 2 private security contractors to ensure my parents cannot physically remove us before we deliver the presentation. We execute the breach exactly at 8 o'clock. That is when my father plans to take the stage and announce Brittany as the new chief executive officer. I will see you at the valet, Jamal said. Do not show mercy, Lauren. They ran out of my mercy 5 years ago, I replied, ending the call. I walked out of my hotel room and rode the elevator down to the lobby. The private black car I had hired was idling quietly against the curb. I slid into the back seat, giving the driver a sharp nod. The city lights of Chicago blurred past the tinted windows as we navigated the busy downtown streets. I watched the luxury storefronts and towering skyscrapers pass by my mind, replaying every single instance of abuse I had endured from my family. The casual insults about my demanding career, the way my mother constantly praised Brittany for achieving absolutely nothing, the sickening, gaslighting manipulation Gavin employed every time he drained my bank accounts to fuel his hidden gambling addiction. They had fed off my labor, my sanity, and my resources for years. Tonight, I was cutting the supply line permanently. The adrenaline humming through my veins felt completely different from the panic I had experienced on Tuesday. This was power. Pure, unadulterated power. The Waldorf Astoria loomed ahead, an architectural masterpiece of stone and glass, radiating wealth and exclusivity. The valet circle was packed with luxury vehicles. Flashbulbs from local society photographers popped near the entrance, capturing the arrival of Chicago elite. My parents had pulled out every single stop to make this night a media spectacle. They wanted an audience. I was going to give them a show they would never ever forget. My driver pulled smoothly to the curb right behind a sleek silver sedan. The back door of the sedan opened and Jamal stepped out. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo, his posture radiating quiet, lethal authority. He caught my eye across the valet lane and gave a single definitive nod. I opened my car door and stepped out into the freezing air. The cold wind whipped the hem of my red gown around my ankles. Mr. Harrison materialized from the shadow of the grand entrance, flanked by two massive men in dark suits. The attorney adjusted his tie, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a truly historic legal slaughter. The federal agents are stationed discreetly at the service exits. Harrison informed us, his voice, a low, steady murmur over the chaotic noise of the arriving guests. They are waiting for my exact signal. Once the wire fraud evidence goes live on that screen, they will move in and lock down the ballroom. Nobody leaves. Jamal pulled his phone from his pocket, pulling up the hijacked audiovisual interface. I have direct access to their main projector. The moment you take the microphone, Lauren, I wipe their slideshow and broadcast the bank statements. I looked up at the towering, opulent doors of the Waldorf Astoria. Behind that glass, my mother was undoubtedly schmoozing with investors, playing the tragic hero who saved her deranged daughter company. Gavin was desperately pretending he was not running out of time with the mob. Brittany was practicing her fake tearful acceptance speech. The conflict tension in the air was so thick it felt physically heavy, wrapping around my chest and sharpening my senses to an absolute razor edge. We stood together on the pavement, a crisis manager, a forensic accountant, and a corporate shark preparing to walk directly into the lion den. We stepped through the heavy revolving doors of the Waldorf Astoria, leaving the brutal Chicago wind behind us. The transition from the freezing pavement to the opulent golden-lit lobby felt like crossing into another universe. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over the polished marble floors. A jazz quartet played softly in the distance, their music mingling with the low hum of wealthy voices and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. I walked flanked by Jamal and Mr. Harrison, moving with the synchronized precision of an invading army. Two private security guards stood at the entrance to the grand ballroom holding leather-bound guest lists. They stepped forward to block our path, clearly instructed to keep out anyone not expressly approved by my parents. Mr. Harrison did not even break his stride. He smoothly withdrew a federal injunction document from his breast pocket and flashed it directly in the face of the head guard, informing him in a low, dangerous whisper that interfering with our entry would result in immediate arrest for obstructing a federal investigation. The guards wisely stepped aside, pulling open the massive double doors. The moment we crossed the threshold, the sheer scale of my family narcissism hit me. The ballroom was packed with over 300 guests. Chicago elite politicians, venture capitalists, and top-tier media personalities circulated through the room. Waiters in white gloves balanced silver trays of caviar and champagne. Massive floral arrangements of white orchids dominated every table. In the center of the room stood a ridiculous towering ice sculpture carved into the shape of the Aegis Communications logo. It was a grotesque display of stolen wealth. I scanned the room and quickly located my targets. Brittany was standing near the front of the main stage wearing a sequined silver gown, laughing obnoxiously for a hired photographer. Gavin was hovering near one of the private bars, clutching a glass of bourbon, looking sickly pale and constantly checking his phone. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were holding court near the center of the room, loudly boasting to a group of major tech investors. I stepped fully into the light of the ballroom. The blood-red silk of my designer gown acted like a flare in the darkness. Against the sea of muted pastels, black tuxedos, and silver dresses, I was entirely impossible to ignore. A woman standing near the entrance gasped, her champagne flute pausing halfway to her mouth. The whisper started there and rippled outward, spreading across the room like a wave. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The jazz music suddenly felt too loud in the rapidly quieting room. It took exactly 30 seconds for my mother to notice the shift in the crowd attention. Patricia turned around, a fake practice smile frozen on her face. When her eyes locked onto mine, the smile shattered completely. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She grabbed my father's arm, her manicured nails digging violently into his tuxedo jacket. Richard spun around, his eyes widening in absolute horror. They abandoned their wealthy investors instantly and practically sprinted across the ballroom floor toward us. My mother immediately activated her victim routine. She raised her voice, ensuring the surrounding guests could hear her performance. "Lauren, sweetheart, what are you doing here?" Patricia cried out, rushing forward with her arms extended as if to embrace a deeply disturbed child. "You are supposed to be at the wellness clinic. Everyone, please excuse us. My daughter is severely mentally unwell. She is having another terrible paranoid episode. We need to get her medical help right now." My father stepped aggressively toward me, his face flushing with genuine humiliated rage. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "Security is going to drag you out of here in handcuffs, Lauren. You are trespassing on a private corporate event. You need to leave this building immediately before you embarrass this family any further." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer them a single syllable of response. I simply kept walking. When my father tried to physically grab my arm, Jamal stepped smoothly between us. Jamal did not say a word, but his imposing athletic frame and his cold, unyielding stare forced my father to stumble backward in shock. Mr. Harrison stepped up beside Jamal, casually adjusting his tie while smiling at my panicked parents. "Do not touch my client," Mr. Harrison warned, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "And I highly suggest you save your breath, Richard. You are going to need it for the federal agents waiting outside." My parents froze, paralyzed by the sudden mention of federal agents. Their grand defense completely crumbled, leaving them stranded in the middle of the ballroom as guests stared at them in utter confusion. I walked right past them, leaving them in the dust of their own ruined narrative. I glided through the crowd, my head held high, my posture radiating absolute authority. The wealthy investors and media personalities parted from me like the Red Sea, their eyes tracking my every movement. The room had fallen into a heavy, expectant silence. They could feel the electric charge of the impending disaster. The flashbulbs of the society photographers began to fire rapidly, capturing every step of my ascent. I approached the main stage. The hired master of ceremonies, a minor local television personality, was standing at the podium holding a microphone. He looked completely bewildered by the sudden shift in the room dynamic. He opened his mouth to speak, but I stepped gracefully onto the stage and simply extended my hand. He surrendered the microphone without a single word of protest, stepping back into the shadows. I walked to the exact center of the stage. The glaring spotlight hit my face, illuminating the red silk of my gown. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw Brittany staring up at me, her jaw dropped in pure terror. I saw Gavin trembling by the bar looking like a man standing on the gallows. I saw my parents frozen in the center aisle, their perfect social image cracking into a million irreparable pieces. I tapped the microphone with one perfectly manicured fingernail. The sharp, echoing thump silenced the final remaining whispers in the grand ballroom. I smiled. It was a cold, radiant, devastating smile. "Good evening, Chicago," I said, my voice ringing out with the absolute flawless composure of a master crisis manager. "Thank you all for coming out tonight to celebrate this beautiful illusion. I am Lauren, the true founder of Aegis Communications, and I am here to officially correct the public record. Please direct your attention to the main screens because the new management team has a few massive financial discrepancies they desperately need to answer for." Before anyone could process the sheer weight of that statement, I turned my attention directly to the center aisle where my parents stood completely paralyzed. "We are allegedly here tonight to celebrate Richard and Patricia's 35th wedding anniversary," I said, my voice echoing across the cavernous space with absolute clarity. 35 years of marriage is indeed a significant milestone. But what we are really celebrating tonight is 35 years of absolute illusion. You have spent decades building a flawless societal facade, curating this perfect, untouchable family image for everyone in this room. You smiled for the cameras, hosted the endless charity dinners, and demanded nothing less than complete obedience from your children to maintain your pristine reputation. But behind closed doors, your legacy is built on a foundation of staggering financial abuse, breathtaking favoritism, and criminal cover-ups. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the faint clinking of ice melting in untouched cocktail glasses. Politicians who had eagerly posed for photos with my father mere minutes ago were now physically taking steps backward, visibly distancing themselves from the impending fallout. I watched my mother open her mouth to scream an objection, but the sheer shock had robbed her of her voice. She looked like a ghost, draped in expensive silk. "You see?" I continued, pacing slowly across the edge of the stage like a predator circling its prey, when my parents discovered that their golden child, their precious newly appointed Chief Executive Officer Brittany, had committed a catastrophic felony. They did not hold her accountable. They did not teach her the harsh lessons of reality. Instead, they decided to sacrifice my entire livelihood to bail her out. They orchestrated the hostile takeover of my company, forged my signature on federal transfer documents, and tried to strip me of every single asset I have ever earned. And they did it all to cover up a theft so sickening, so deeply depraved that it requires visual aids. I looked toward the back of the massive ballroom and locked eyes with Jamal. He stood near the main audio-visual control booth, his tall frame cloaked in shadows, his fingers resting lightly on his tablet. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Jamal executed the final command. The massive, towering projector screens flanking the main stage, which had previously been cycling through a carefully curated montage of fake happy family portraits, suddenly went pitch black. A collective gasp rippled through the sophisticated audience. Then the screens flared back to life with blinding white light. "Let us begin with the absolute moral bankruptcy of my husband Gavin and my sister Brittany," I announced, pointing toward the colossal displays. High-definition images filled the screens. They were not subtle. Jamal had pulled the encrypted text logs, private jet itineraries, and luxury hotel receipts. The audience was forced to look at undeniable, heavily documented proof of an 8-month-long affair. Timestamps showed Gavin and Brittany booking expensive suites at the Four Seasons on the exact days Gavin claimed to be on hedge fund business trips. There were graphic, damning text exchanges displayed in massive, undeniable font, detailing their secret rendezvous and their utter contempt for the spouses they were actively deceiving. A heavy, suffocating wave of disgust washed over the crowd. I saw several prominent wives of venture capitalists cover their mouths in shock. Whispers erupted into loud, frantic murmuring. The social elite of Chicago were witnessing a live execution. Gavin dropped his glass of bourbon. It shattered against the polished dance floor, the sound cutting sharply through the rising chaos. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting toward the exits. But Mr. Harrison private security contractors were blocking the heavy brass doors. Brittany let out a shrill, piercing shriek, covering her face with her trembling hands as her perfectly constructed lifestyle influencer persona evaporated into thin air. But infidelity is merely a character flaw, I said, my voice rising over the escalating noise of the crowd, commanding their absolute attention. The real tragedy, the reason we are all gathered here tonight, is what this affair cost. Or rather, who it cost. I signaled Jamal again. The screens transitioned away from the hotel receipts and loaded a series of highly classified, heavily redacted banking statements. The raw financial data was highlighted in neon yellow, making the numbers impossible to ignore. Gavin likes to portray himself as a brilliant hedge fund manager, I explained, gesturing to the massive numbers looming over the stage. But behind the tailored suits and the fake corporate bravado, he is a degenerate gambling addict. He managed to rack up a $2 million debt with an underground sports betting syndicate. When violent criminals came to collect, he panicked. He needed liquid cash immediately to save his own life. I turned my gaze directly onto Brittany. She was shaking violently, her silver sequined dress catching the harsh glare of the projector screens. So he turned to his mistress. I continued relentlessly. And Brittany, desperate to keep her lover out of a wooden box, decided to find the funds. But she did not use her own money because Brittany has never earned a single dollar in her life. Instead, she used her parental access to raid her own household. The documents currently displayed on these screens are the direct wire transfer logs from the protected educational trust funds of Jamal and Brittany, two innocent children. The ballroom erupted. The initial murmurs of shock instantly transformed into an uproar of visceral horror. Stealing a company was a corporate dispute. Cheating on a spouse was a scandal. But embezzling $2 million from the college funds of your own children to pay off a lover gambling debts was a line of depravity that completely disgusted every single elite guest in the room. Look at the timestamps, I instructed, letting my voice crack like a whip over the horrified crowd. You are looking at the exact moments Brittany drained her own children's future to pay off organized crime syndicates. And my parents, the hosts of this beautiful evening, discovered this theft 2 weeks ago. Instead of calling the authorities, they conspired to steal my $5 million public relations firm, planning to quietly liquidate my life work and replace the stolen funds before Jamal could run his annual household audit. I stared down at my mother and father. The surrounding guests had physically backed away from them, leaving them stranded in a wide, empty circle of absolute social ruin. My father's face was devoid of all color, his chest heaving as he realized his prestigious career and his flawless reputation were permanently destroyed. My mother was clutching her throat violently, shaking her head, trying to deny the overwhelming brightly lit evidence projected above her. They thought they could sacrifice me in the dark to protect their golden child, I declared, my voice echoing with pure, unfiltered power. They thought I would quietly accept my own destruction to save this fake family legacy. They were wrong. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was shattered by a piercing, hysterical shriek. Brittany could no longer maintain her facade. The sheer weight of public exposure had completely broken her carefully constructed influencer persona. She stomped forward, her silver sequined dress catching the light as she pointed a manicured finger directly at the stage. "You are lying!" Brittany screamed, her voice cracking with desperate, unhinged fury. "You are just a bitter, jealous woman. You are having a mental breakdown because Mom and Dad realized you were completely unfit to run Aegis Communications. You lost your company because you are unstable. You are just trying to ruin my big night because you are deeply jealous that I am the new chief executive officer and you are absolutely nothing." I looked down at my younger sister from the elevated stage. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in response to her frantic shrieking. Instead, I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had just locked the cage and thrown away the key. "Jealous," I repeated softly, letting the microphone amplify the deadly calm in my voice. "You think I am jealous because you stole my company." I reached into the small, elegant clutch resting on the podium. I pulled out a thick stack of heavily stamped federal documents. The bright blue ink of the Internal Revenue Service seal was visible even from the front row. I held the paperwork high in the air for the entire ballroom to see. 3 years ago, I announced ensuring every single investor and media personality in the room heard my words perfectly. I recognized that I was surrounded by financial predators. So I quietly restructured my entire corporate empire. Aegis Communications. The firm you so proudly stole yesterday morning does not own a single intellectual property right. It does not own the proprietary crisis management software. It does not even own the desks in the downtown office. I transferred all real assets to a blind Delaware holding company named Vanguard Strategic Holdings, an entity that I own 100%. The arrogant defiance on Brittany's face began to melt into profound confusion. Gavin, still standing by the bar, suddenly grabbed the edge of the counter as if the floor had dropped out from underneath him. He understood corporate structures. He realized instantly what I had done. Aegis is nothing but an empty shell. I continued relentlessly. It is a fake corporate sponge that I deliberately designed to absorb highly aggressive tax deductions and deferred financial liabilities. While Vanguard remained flawlessly clean, Aegis accumulated massive, heavily penalized debt. My legal team and I have been quietly fighting a brutal federal audit for the past 8 months. I stepped to the very edge of the stage, looking directly into Brittany's terrified eyes. When you and Gavin forged my signature on those transfer documents, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper that commanded the silent room, you did not steal a $5 million gold mine. You legally filed paperwork to assume absolute liability for a completely bankrupt entity. So congratulations, Brittany. You just committed federal forgery to inherit a $4 million tax debt. Brittany staggered backward as if I had physically struck her. She collided with a cocktail table, sending crystal glasses crashing to the marble floor. No, she gasped, shaking her head wildly. No, that is impossible. The clients, the revenue. Aegis makes millions. I let out a sharp, joyless laugh. Aegis does not make a single dime, Brittany. Because every single elite client on the roster, the massive tech conglomerates, the politicians, the international brands, they all hold binding service agreements exclusively with Vanguard Strategic Holdings. Aegis merely acted as a third-party servicing vendor, and those contracts contained a very strict legally binding key personnel clause. I gestured toward Mr. Harrison, who stood near the entrance with a satisfied smirk on his face. As of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, I declared when you officially filed those forged documents to remove me as active director, every single VIP client contract was instantly rendered null and void. My transition team contacted the entire roster immediately. I am thrilled to announce that 100% of the client base officially terminated their relationship with Aegis Communications this morning. They all signed brand new exclusive contracts directly with Vanguard. The ballroom erupted in a cacophony of shocked murmurs and frantic business whispers. The wealthy investors whom my parents had spent all night trying to impress were now actively texting their own legal teams, desperate to sever any possible ties with my family. The sheer magnitude of the financial trap was breathtaking. You stole a company that generates absolutely zero revenue, I stated, driving the final nail into the coffin of her corporate dreams. You cannot sell the client list because you do not own it. You cannot sell the software because you do not own it. You literally possess nothing but a fancy office lease you cannot afford to pay and a $4 million federal tax bill that the Internal Revenue Service is going to collect directly from your personal accounts. My father let out a strangled, agonizing groan. He grabbed his chest, his perfectly tailored tuxedo suddenly looking entirely too large for his rapidly deflating frame. He finally understood the absolute, inescapable ruin I had orchestrated. By participating in the forgery to save Brittany from Jamal's audit, my parents had actively aided in a massive federal fraud scheme. They had knowingly tied themselves to an empty company drowning in government debt. You destroyed us! My mother shrieked, her voice echoing with raw, unfiltered panic. She lunged forward, no longer caring about the society photographers documenting her total collapse. You planned this. You deliberately set us up to lose everything. I stared at the woman who had treated me like a disposable tool for decades. The shell game was finally over. I truly did not set you up to lose everything. I replied, my voice slicing through my mother's frantic accusations. I simply stopped preventing you from destroying yourselves. You chose to forge federal documents. You chose to steal from your own daughter. I just made sure that when you finally pulled the trigger, the barrel was pointed entirely at your own financial ruin. Gavin had just remained frozen near the private bar during my entire speech, but the terrifying reality of his situation was finally penetrating his panic. He was not just facing a massive tax liability or a ruined reputation. He owed $2 million to a violent underground sports betting syndicate. He had promised those dangerous men that he would have their money by tomorrow morning, banking entirely on the rapid liquidation of Aegis Communications. Now he had no company to sell, no hidden assets to leverage, and his name was inextricably tied to an active federal tax audit. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. The sheer, utterly suffocating terror in Gavin's eyes abruptly mutated into a blind, animalistic rage. He let out a raw, guttural scream that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. He kicked a cocktail table out of his way, sending expensive champagne bottles crashing to the marble floor, and launched himself directly toward the main stage. He sprinted down the center aisle, his fists clenched, his face contorted into an ugly mask of pure violence. He intended to physically assault me right there in front of 300 elite guests. Several people screamed. My mother shrieked and scrambled backward out of his path. Mr. Harrison's security contractors moved to intercept, but they were too far away. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still in my red silk gown, because I knew I was absolutely protected. Before Gavin could even reach the first step of the stage, a tall shadow detached itself from the audiovisual booth. Jamal moved with terrifying athletic precision. The brilliant forensic accountant did not shout or hesitate. He stepped smoothly into the center aisle, planting his feet firmly on the polished marble. As Gavin lunged forward, blindly swinging his fists, Jamal intercepted him with flawless timing. Jamal grabbed the lapels of Gavin's expensive tuxedo jacket, the fine fabric tearing slightly under the immense pressure of his grip, using Gavin's own frantic momentum entirely against him. With a sharp, incredibly powerful twist of his broad shoulders, Jamal swept Gavin off his feet and slammed him violently onto the hard floor. The heavy, breathless thud of Gavin hitting the marble sent a shockwave of silence through the screaming crowd. Gavin gasped, all the air completely knocked out of his lungs, his arms flailing weakly as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. Jamal did not strike him again. He simply stood over my treacherous husband, his polished dress shoes planted firmly next to Gavin's face, radiating absolute cold authority. "You stay exactly where you are," Jamal commanded, his voice, a deep, resonant rumble that demanded total compliance. "If you attempt to move toward Lauren again, I will personally ensure you leave this ballroom in an ambulance before you leave in a police cruiser. Do you understand me?" Gavin wheezed, curling into a pathetic ball on the floor, clutching his bruised ribs. He offered a weak, trembling nod. Jamal slowly shifted his gaze away from the broken man on the floor and turned his attention to his wife. Brittany was standing a few feet away, her hands covering her mouth, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Seeing her powerful, wealthy lover completely neutralized by her husband finally broke whatever delusional reality she had been clinging to. She looked at Jamal, and for a brief, pathetic second, she actually tried to use her standard manipulation tactics on him. "Jamal, please," Brittany sobbed, taking a hesitant step toward him, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face. "You have to help me. They are lying. Lauren is lying about the money. Gavin forced me to do it. You are my husband. You have to protect me." Jamal's expression did not soften. His dark eyes were devoid of any affection, any warmth, or any trace of the man who had quietly supported her for years. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored midnight blue tuxedo jacket and withdrew a thick, sealed legal envelope. "I am not your husband," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute clinical detachment. "I am a forensic accountant who spent the last 48 hours tracking exactly how you stole $2 million from the educational trust funds of our own innocent children. I tracked the flights you took with the man bleeding on the floor right next to you." I track the luxury suites you booked while you claimed you were attending wellness retreats. He stepped forward and firmly pressed the heavy envelope directly against her chest, forcing her to take it. "Those are your divorce papers," Jamal announced, projecting his voice so every single society reporter and investor in the room could hear the terms of her destruction. "They are completely non-negotiable. I have already secured sole legal and physical custody of both of our children. You are entirely stripped of any marital assets and you are solely responsible for your own debts." Brittany stared at the envelope as if it were coated in poison. She tried to hand it back, but Jamal stepped away, refusing to touch her entirely. Tucked directly behind the divorce decree is a strict active restraining order authorized by a judge this very afternoon, Jamal continued relentlessly. "Because you committed severe financial abuse against minors, the court has officially deemed you a threat to your own children. You are legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of my house, my office, or my kids ever again. If you attempt to contact them, if you attempt to attend their school events, or if you even show up in my neighborhood, you will be arrested on sight." Brittany's knees finally buckled. She gasped for air, the harsh reality of her self-inflicted destruction finally piercing her thick armor of narcissism. She quickly collapsed onto the marble floor, her voluminous silver gown pooling around her as she let out a loud, agonizing wail. She dropped her face into her hands, completely undone. The spoiled golden child, the arrogant woman who had spent her entire life stealing my achievements and parading around as a superior being, was now sitting on the floor of the Waldorf Astoria, next to her ruined lover, clutching divorce papers and a restraining order. She had absolutely nothing left. Her children were gone. Her marriage was over. Her fake corporate title was a federal liability trap, and she owed the government $4 million she could never repay. The wealthy investors and elite socialites shrank back against the silk-draped walls, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. They were witnessing the utter dismantling of a prominent Chicago family, a public execution executed entirely with paper trails and undeniable facts. Jamal looked down at her one last time, adjusting his cuffs with perfect composure. "You thought I was just a quiet man who would happily balance your checkbook and ignore your lies," Jamal said, his words serving as the final epitaph to their marriage. "You forgot that I verify everything. Enjoy your new life, Brittany. You earned every single piece of it." I stood on the stage watching the total spectacular collapse of my enemies. The physical threat was neutralized. The legal traps were sprung. The social annihilation was absolutely complete. But the night was not over yet. The grand finale we had meticulously planned was already waiting right outside the heavy brass doors of the ballroom. The heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom did not simply open. They were thrust apart with a violent, synchronized force that echoed like a thunderclap across the marble floors. The remaining murmurs of the wealthy guests were instantly extinguished. Through the wide entrance marched a highly disciplined, imposing phalanx of men and women wearing stark, dark windbreakers. The bold, golden-yellow letters printed across their backs read FBI and IRS. They moved with absolute unapologetic authority, completely indifferent to the crystal chandeliers, the imported floral arrangements, and the multi-million-dollar net worth of the individuals they were currently pushing past. Mr. Harrison, standing near the edge of the stage, gave me a subtle, knowing nod. He stepped forward to intercept the lead federal investigator, a tall, severe-looking woman who carried a thick stack of manila folders that looked remarkably similar to the dossiers Jamal and I had compiled. Mr. Harrison spoke to her in a hushed, professional tone, gesturing clearly toward the center of the dance floor where my ruined family was currently clustered in a state of absolute shock. The federal agents fanned out instantly, securing every single exit of the ballroom. Several highly paid security guards hired by my parents attempted to intervene, but a single flash of a federal badge sent them retreating immediately into the shadows. The Chicago elite, the politicians, and the venture capitalists who had eagerly attended this gala to network and drink free champagne were now practically climbing over each other to press their backs against the silk-draped walls. Nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire of a federal raid. They held their collective breath, watching the ultimate consequences of my family greed unfold in real time. The lead investigator, flanked by four heavily armed agents, marched directly toward the center aisle. My mother let out a strangled, terrified gasp and physically hid behind my father. Richard stood frozen, his face completely devoid of blood, watching the federal authorities approach the wreckage of his perfect family. Brittany remained collapsed on the floor, clutching her divorce papers, too paralyzed by her own $4 million tax nightmare to even comprehend the new threat entering the room. But the agents did not stop at Brittany. They marched right past her trembling form and formed a tight, inescapable circle around the man who was still wheezing on the polished marble floor. Gavin scrambled backward, his expensive tuxedo jacket torn his chest, heaving with sheer panic. He hit the base of a cocktail table and had nowhere left to run. He looked up at the circle of federal agents looming over him. The lead investigator looked down at him with an expression of absolute disgust. "Gavin," she announced, her voice projecting clearly across the dead silent ballroom. "You are under arrest." "Wait," Gavin stammered, raising his hands defensively. "You have the wrong person. I am a victim here. My wife is going through a severe mental health crisis. She set this up. She forged the documents." The investigator ignored his pathetic, desperate lies entirely. She pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. "You are being charged by the United States Department of Justice with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and the forgery of federal documents. You are also being detained in connection with an active investigation into an illegal offshore sports betting syndicate and money laundering operations." The words struck Gavin like a physical barrage. Wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. The sheer weight of the federal charges completely crushed any remaining hope he had of manipulating his way out of the situation. Two agents stepped forward, grabbing him roughly by the arms and hauling him to his feet. They spun him around, slamming his chest against the polished surface of a nearby pillar, and aggressively ratcheted the steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the quiet room. Gavin struggled against the restraint, his panic elevating into a state of absolute wild desperation. He whipped his head around, desperately searching the room for anyone who could save him. He looked at my father, the man who had actively conspired to steal my company to protect him. Richard immediately averted his eyes, physically turning his back on his son-in-law to preserve whatever tiny shred of deniability he thought he had left. He looked at Brittany, his partner in crime and his mistress. She was rocking back and forth on the floor, completely consumed by her own catastrophic ruin, entirely useless to him. Finally, his frantic, terrified eyes found me. I was still standing on the elevated stage, my red silk gown glowing under the spotlight, watching his execution with cold, unwavering satisfaction. "Lauren!" Gavin screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror as the agents began to drag him down the center aisle. "Lauren, please. You have to help me. You are a crisis manager. You know how to fix this. You know how to talk to the press. Please, baby. I am your husband. I made a mistake. I was scared. They were going to kill me over the gambling debts. You have the money to pay them off. You have the offshore accounts. Please do not let them take me to prison. I will do anything you want." His pathetic begging pleas echoed through the grand ballroom, completely humiliating him in front of the very society he had tried so hard to impress. The elite guests watched in absolute horror as the handsome, arrogant hedge fund manager was reduced to a crying, pleading criminal begging his betrayed wife for salvation. I walked slowly to the edge of the stage. The federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, allowing me to look directly down into the eyes of the man who had tried to leave me destitute and locked in a psychiatric ward. He stared up at me, tears streaming down his bruised face, his hands bound behind his back. He was waiting for my mercy. He was waiting for the woman who had spent 5 years fixing his financial disasters to step in and save his life one last time. I looked down at him. I thought about the black box he had left on my welcome mat. I thought about the elegant silver ribbon, the forged eviction notice, and the handwritten card carrying my mother's cold, calculated instructions. I channeled every ounce of their cruelty, every single drop of their malicious arrogance, and I reflected it directly back into his terrified eyes. "Do not make a scene," I said. My voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of any emotion, perfectly mirroring the exact warning they had delivered to me just a few days ago. The absolute finality of my words struck Gavin with devastating force. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The last shred of hope completely vanished from his eyes, leaving nothing but the terrifying realization that he was entirely alone and he was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. "Get him out of here," the lead investigator ordered sharply. The agents shoved Gavin forward, marching the weeping broken man past the ice sculptures, past the floral arrangements, and directly out the heavy brass doors of the Waldorf Astoria. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, sealing his fate completely. I stood on the stage listening to the fading sound of his footsteps. The first massive threat had been successfully neutralized. Gavin was gone forever. But as I turned my attention back to the center of the ballroom, I saw my parents and my sister trembling in the wreckage of their stolen empire. The federal agents had not left the room. They were simply repositioning themselves. The night of absolute reckoning was far from over. The night of absolute reckoning was far from over. The lead federal investigator turned her attention away from the doors and marched directly toward my parents and Brittany. The remaining guests scrambled to get out of her way. She handed Brittany a stack of official documents, formally serving her with the $4 million federal tax liability notice. Brittany stared at the papers with blank, uncomprehending eyes, her hands shaking violently. The investigator then turned to Richard and Patricia, informing them that their involvement in the forged corporate transfer was under active federal review. If they did not cooperate entirely with the Internal Revenue Service, they would be indicted alongside their daughter. My parents did not shout or argue. The absolute terror of federal prison silenced them. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, handing my father legal filings detailing the civil suits I was bringing against them for the hostile takeover attempt. I watched the last remaining high society guests run toward the coat check. Nobody wanted to be photographed near my family. The grand anniversary gala had officially transformed into a crime scene. Jamal and I walked out of the hotel together, leaving my parents and sister standing alone in the center of the empty ballroom surrounded by melting ice sculptures and shattered glass. The fallout over the next several weeks was swift and absolutely brutal. The federal authorities do not move slowly when millions of dollars in tax liabilities and wire fraud are involved. Gavin was denied bail, completely isolated in a federal detention center while he awaited trial for his gambling debts and embezzlement. But the true devastation fell squarely on the shoulders of the people who had orchestrated my ruin. My parents realized very quickly that high society loyalty is entirely conditional. The moment the news of the federal raid leaked to the Chicago financial press, Richard and Patricia were immediately shunned. The exclusive country club they had belonged to for 20 years quietly revoked their membership, citing a violation of their moral conduct clause. The elite friends they had spent decades trying to impress suddenly blocked their phone numbers. They became absolute pariahs in the very circles they had sacrificed me to join. But the social exile was nothing compared to their financial destruction. The Internal Revenue Service demanded immediate satisfaction of the $4 million tax debt that Brittany had legally assumed when she signed those forged transfer documents. To keep their precious golden child out of a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud, my parents had to make a devastating sacrifice. They were forced to completely liquidate their entire retirement portfolios, cashing out decades of careful investments and paying massive early withdrawal penalties just to generate liquid capital. It was not enough to satisfy the relentless federal collectors. With their bank accounts drained and their legal fees mounting by the hour, Richard and Patricia had no choice but to put their sprawling suburban mansion on the market. Because the federal investigation was highly publicized, potential buyers knew my parents were desperate. They were forced to sell the massive estate at a staggering, humiliating loss, barely making enough to cover the remaining tax penalties and pay the defense attorneys keeping Brittany out of handcuffs. I received the final property transfer alert from my legal team on a rainy Tuesday morning. My parents had officially handed over the keys to their mansion. With absolutely zero remaining wealth, they signed a lease on a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment in a heavily industrialized neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The woman who used to boast about imported Italian marble was now living in a building with peeling paint, noisy radiators, and a view of a concrete parking lot. Richard was reduced to driving a battered used car to a low-level consulting job that barely paid enough to cover their basic utilities. They had traded a life of extreme luxury for a life of perpetual grinding anxiety. Brittany faced an even harsher reality. Because Jamal had successfully secured sole legal and physical custody of their children and a strict restraining order, Brittany was completely isolated. She had no husband to fund her lavish lifestyle and no access to the trust funds she had previously raided. The court had stripped her of all marital assets during the divorce proceedings. The Internal Revenue Service placed a maximum legal garnishment on her Social Security number. The former lifestyle influencer, the golden child who had spent her entire existence bragging to her followers about designer clothes and exclusive wellness retreats, was left utterly penniless. With no college degree, a massive gap in her employment history, and a heavily publicized corporate fraud scandal attached to her name, Brittany was entirely unemployable in the professional sector. She was forced to take the only job that would accept her. My legal team sent me a single, highly satisfying photograph taken by a private investigator confirming her employment status. Brittany was wearing a hideous, oversized polyester uniform vest. She was standing behind the folding table of a discount retail clothing store in a cheap strip mall, looking exhausted, miserable, and completely defeated. Every single week, the federal government legally seized the vast majority of her minimum wage paycheck before she even saw it, leaving her with barely enough money to buy groceries. She was trapped in an endless cycle of manual labor to pay off the debt she had stolen from me. They had planned to break me, label me as mentally unstable, and live like royalty on the ashes of my career. Instead, I had successfully forced them to consume their own poison. The criminal syndicate they called a family was dismantled. Every vicious lie they told, every manipulation they executed, and every betrayal they committed had ultimately sealed their horrific fate. They were finally paying the ultimate price, leaving me perfectly positioned to move forward without them. This absolute devastation was the only acceptable conclusion to their staggering arrogance and blinding greed permanently delivered. With the absolute devastation permanently delivered, the legal severing of my past became a mere formality. My divorce from Gavin moved through the family court system with unprecedented speed. Because he was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, facing a mountain of wire fraud and embezzlement charges, his ability to contest the divorce was entirely non-existent. Mr. Harrison drafted an ironclad settlement agreement. I kept 100% of Vanguard Strategic Holdings, all of my offshore accounts, and every single domestic investment I had ever built. Gavin, in a desperate and pathetic bid to show the federal judge he was taking responsibility prior to his sentencing, signed the paperwork from his jail cell without making a single demand. He surrendered everything. The legal chains that bound me to a parasitic traitor were officially and permanently shattered. Next, I ruthlessly purged the physical remnants of my old life. The sprawling house I had purchased, the very same property Gavin and my parents had tried to evict me from using forged documents, suddenly felt deeply tainted. It held the lingering echoes of fake affection and calculated betrayals. I listed the property on the market the exact day the divorce was finalized. Because of its prime location and flawless interior design, it sparked a fierce bidding war and sold for significantly above the asking price in less than a week. I packed only my personal necessities, my clothes, my files, and my absolute essentials. I left the heavy furniture and the bad memories behind for the new owners to deal with. With the massive profit from the house sale and my newly liberated assets, I purchased my true sanctuary. I bought a breathtaking multi-million-dollar penthouse perched high above the city, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of Lake Michigan. Walking into that space for the first time felt like stepping into an entirely new atmosphere. The floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the open-concept living area with brilliant natural light. The stark white walls, the gleaming hardwood floors, and the elegant minimalist aesthetic were the exact opposite of the cluttered, chaotic suburban life I had left behind. Standing on the expansive glass balcony, feeling the cold, crisp wind rolling off the water, I finally felt completely untouchable. Unburdened by the dead weight of my past, my professional life skyrocketed to heights I had never even imagined. Vanguard Strategic Holdings did not just survive the transition from the Aegis Shell Company, it absolutely dominated the market. My elite clients, having witnessed my flawless execution during my own highly publicized family crisis, doubled down on their contracts. They knew with absolute certainty that if I could surgically dismantle a coordinated federal fraud scheme orchestrated by my own flesh and blood, I could easily handle any corporate disaster they threw my way. My firm expanded rapidly, taking over 2 entire floors in a premier commercial building right in the heart of downtown Chicago. I hired the absolute best crisis managers in the country, paying them top-tier salaries and building a fiercely loyal corporate culture. I was no longer working 80-hour weeks out of pure desperation to cover a husband's secret underground gambling debts. I was working because I loved the empire I was building. I walked into my office every single morning feeling powerful, respected, and entirely in control of my own destiny. But the most profound and beautiful change in my life was the silence. For 33 years, my daily existence had been polluted by a constant, exhausting stream of toxic manipulation. The endless phone calls from my mother demanding money or social favors, the passive-aggressive remarks about my demanding career, the constant draining need to be the responsible workhorse so Brittany could safely play the golden child. All of it simply vanished. Waking up in my penthouse, the quiet was not lonely. It was incredibly rich and deeply restorative. I drank my morning coffee, watching the sun rise over the brilliant blue lake, my phone completely free of guilt trips and fabricated family emergencies. I no longer had to brace myself for the next financial disaster or navigate the emotional minefield of a tense holiday dinner. The immense mental energy I used to spend defending my boundaries was now entirely redirected into my own personal growth. The physical and psychological toll of living in a state of constant threat had been immense, and I only realized how heavy the burden was once it was finally lifted. I slept deeply through the night for the first time in a decade. I started traveling for pure pleasure, booking first-class flights to Tokyo, Rome, and the Maldives, exploring the world without ever having to check in with a family who would judge my spending or demand a piece of my success. I realized that my parents and my husband had kept me small by convincing me I owed them my survival. They had masked their financial and emotional abuse as familial duty, keeping me trapped in a cycle of endless giving while they took everything they could reach. Removing them was exactly like cutting a massive iron anchor off my ankle right before drowning. I breached the surface. I filled my lungs with clean air. I was rising from the ashes they created, building a life of absolute peace, staggering success, and brilliant silence. The first snow of this season was falling over Lake Michigan, dusting the Chicago skyline in pristine white. I stood in the massive kitchen of my penthouse, pulling a roasted turkey from the double oven. The aroma of rosemary filled the air, mingling with the fresh pine garlands on the island. It was Thanksgiving Day. This holiday used to be an exhausting marathon of emotional endurance. I used to spend this holiday bracing myself for my mother's passive-aggressive comments, enduring fatherly complaints, and watching Gavin text his bookies while Brittany demanded compliments. Today my home was free of that performance. There was no tension. There was only the joyful sound of jazz and the absolute certainty that I was safe. The elevator chimed, signaling my guests. I set the roasting pan down, wiped my hands, and walked toward the foyer with an effortless smile. The doors opened, revealing Jamal and his 2 children, Trey and Nia. Jamal was carrying 2 large bakery boxes filled with fresh pies. His face relaxed and glowing with an authentic happiness I had rarely seen during his years married to my sister. The dark circles under his eyes were completely gone. The kids rushed forward, throwing their arms around my waist. They called me Aunt Lauren, their uncomplicated love warming my heart. I hugged them back fiercely. We survived the blast radius of my family greed, emerging remarkably whole. Jamal set the dessert boxes on the kitchen island and pulled me into a firm, grounding hug. "You look incredibly happy, Lauren," he said, his voice rich with sincere gratitude. I stepped back, taking in the forensic accountant who had handed me the blueprints to my freedom. "I have never been better," I replied. We spent the next hour preparing the side dishes and setting the dining table. There was no chaotic rushing, no screaming over misplaced silverware, and absolutely no performative hostility. We simply talked, laughed, and enjoyed the quiet rhythm of preparing a shared meal. Trey and Nia sat nearby on the plush living room rug, building a massive fortress out of wooden blocks. Watching them, I felt a profound sense of validation. Jamal had fiercely protected their educational trusts and secured their emotional well-being. By ripping Brittany out of their daily existence, he had guaranteed these children a future filled with stability and genuine affection. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a spectacular fiery orange glow across the frozen expanse of the lake, we took our seats at the table. We passed plates of roasted vegetables and warm bread, sharing stories that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate profits or social status. We talked about Trey, new fascination with astronomy, Nia's success in her middle school debate club, and the exciting expansion Vanguard Strategic Holdings was launching in the spring. We were present, engaged, and deeply appreciative of the exact moment we were sharing. Halfway through the meal, Jamal picked up his crystal wine glass. The room naturally quieted as he looked across the table, his dark eyes meeting mine with a profound, unspoken understanding. We fought a brutal war in the shadows, and we secured a victory that allowed us to reclaim our entire lives. "I want to make a toast," Jamal announced, his voice carrying the deep, resonant authority of a man who had successfully defended his realm. For years we were told that blood was the ultimate bond. We were told that biological ties required us to tolerate endless abuse, to sacrifice our sanity, and to constantly forgive the unforgivable. But we learned the hard way that genetics do not guarantee loyalty. He paused, letting the truth of his words settle over the table. I raised my own glass, my heart swelling with immense pride. "We learned that true family is not something you are simply born into." Jamal continued, a warm, brilliant smile breaking across his face. "True family is built on a foundation of absolute respect. It is built on shared values, unwavering protection, and showing up for each other when the world tries to tear you down. We survived the fire, and we built something stronger from the ashes. So here is to the family we choose." "To the family we choose," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. After Jamal and the kids finally went home, I stood alone on my expansive glass balcony, looking out over the glittering lights of Chicago. The cold night air was refreshing, a sharp reminder that I was fully alive and completely in command of my own destiny. I turned to face you directly. The journey I just shared with you was not simply a story of corporate warfare or financial retaliation. It was a story of survival. For 33 years, I allowed myself to be ground down by the crushing expectations of a family that only viewed me as an exploitable resource. I let them dictate my worth. I let them convince me that my demanding career and my success were somehow character flaws they had to tolerate. They thought they could break me completely. They thought I was weak enough to fold. They tried to bury me with a single cardboard box, not realizing they were handing me the exact matches I needed to burn their lies to the ground. Blood does not make a family. Loyalty, respect, and showing up does. You do not owe your sanity to people who constantly demand your destruction. You do not owe your financial security to people who actively plot to steal it. And you certainly do not owe your future to people who try to chain you to a miserable past. I cut the dead weight out of my life, and for the first time, I can finally breathe. Have you ever had to cut the dead weight out of your life to finally breathe? Share your story below.